What's up, everybody? What's up? How you doing? Shavua Tov, Chodesh Tov. It's a good month. It's the month of Adar, and I hope you're getting ready, pumped up for a day of joy, a day of celebration. This is our great day of Simcha in the year, and we need to get ourselves ready for that. We need to get ourselves prepared because it's a complicated joy that Purim offers us. It's a weird, blurry, complex, morally strange, a topsy-turvy kind of joy that we get on Purim. And so we need to prepare. And here we are in our Mishnah class, and we just have time to sneak it in before Under the Wire. I bet our East Coast friends are not joining us today. But what I want, there is something very, well, there's lots of very important things to talk about straight from the Mishnah. Mishnah Megillah. There's the tractate in the Talmud, or in the Mishnah, which is the original arrangement, is called Megillah, which is interesting. It's not called Purim. It's not called Purim. It's called Megillah. And that should tell you something. The focus then is on the Megillah. And as you may know, Megillah means scroll. Scroll. And literally it means like it's related to the language of rolling up. So it's a roll, a scroll, right? But that tells you something about the focus that the rabbis have when they're thinking about Purim. Their focus is on the scroll that we read from, and the scroll of the story of Esther, Megillat, the scroll of Esther, and that's a mitzvah on Purim. That's one of the things that you're supposed to do on Purim. There's imbibe. Right? Dress up, that's not, you don't even have to dress up. That's just a custom, but you do have to hear the Megillah read. And all of the laws around Purim are almost obsessively concerned with how it's written, how it's read, how it's heard, that experience of just hearing the words. And that's a centerpiece of Purim. Now, that starts to feel like maybe it's just like an obsession with, first of all, a love of text, probably. That's our rabbis, isn't it? But also, like, then it becomes an obsession with the very particular observance of liturgical halachic recitation, right? But one of the things that they're if we take a look at their discussion in the Mishnah, where it starts, you can see there's a lot more going on. Purim really is a holiday that is, in one level of it, our holidays are layered, but one level of it is that it's a holiday that is celebrating, acknowledging, and concerned with the power of text and of writing and of reading and of hearing things read. And that goes all the way back to the book of Esther itself. So before we dive into the Mishnah today, I want to take a look a bit at the book of Esther, and just to give you a taste, of how actually the rabbis are not just coming up with something to get obsessed with. Actually, the story of Esther returns again and again to the power of the word. The power of the word, as it sounds like a different religious cadence, but the power of the written word and the read word, as opposed to the power of the spoken word, which, that's part of the experience, but so we usually speak of the power of the spoken word. Spoken word creates the world. But now it's something about the writing that matters. And after all, we're a people of the book, right? Said the Muslims so beautifully. And we care about this book. And now on this holiday, we care about another book. Okay. So what's the relationship to that book? So why don't we take a little breath, and a little blessing, and then we'll take a look at the book of Esther, and then we'll get into the Mishnah, and we'll get just as far as we can get. There's a lot of mind-blowingly juicy stuff in this investigation, but we have to just see how much of our minds blown we can get. That's one of the missions of Purim, right? Is like how blown can our minds get, right? So, all right, let's start a little early. Okay, we'll say a blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so here is your source sheet for today, and I'll share it, and as you'll soon see, we will begin. Okay, here's your source sheet for today. Okay, good. Okay, so we're going to begin, as I said, in the book of Esther. Our class today is called Watch Your Language, Scrolls, Scripts, and Speech on Purim, all things that matter a lot on Purim. And here we are, chapter 1 in the book of Esther, chapter 1. So don't have to get very far in to get this. Look at this, script, language. Wait for a little context here, because one of the things we forget about Purim, and this is a whole other level of Purim, is that Purim begins, it takes up eventually anti-Semitism in a very explicit way, but it begins with misogyny. And that connection is made, it's blunt, it's not subtle. It's like the first chapter is about misogyny and male domination, and then the rest of the book is about like anti-Semitism and hey male domination. Okay, so is that a good Haman pun? Probably not. Okay, so let's take a look at this, but take a look at what happens when the men dominate. At the end of the first chapter, these women are getting out of control, and it starts at the top. The queen won't come before the king. She won't parade herself before the king. Famously, the Midrash says probably naked. He wanted her to come naked and show off her wares, and she refused. And then there was like rage from the top on down to dominate all the women in society. And this is how take note of how that rage is expressed. Okay, it's expressed with dispatches sent. Actually, this is already a mistranslation. Scrolls were sent. Scrolls were sent. And the word for scrolls, one of the words is just svarim, which we would know translate as books. Books. But that's not what they were sending. They weren't sending books out. They were sending letters, scrolls, written documents out to all the provinces of the king, to every province in its own script. And this will be really important for us. Every province has its own way of writing, and every nation in its own language. Okay, that sounds more familiar. But take note, let's note right at the outside that language in Hebrew also means tongue. So is it spoken language versus written language? That's one of the things we're going to have to pay attention to, but that's already getting a little too much of an aside here. Let's get back. So every province in its own script, every nation in its own language, that every man should wield authority. Did you think I was like joking about male domination? Every man should wield authority in his home and speak the language of his own people. It's like this seems like the gist, the thrust, the attack is that every man should wield authority, but it's all communicated it's communicated in script, and it's all about how everybody gets it translated just right for them, and the man of the house says this is the language of the house. Language is playing that kind of role. This is like, there's a lot going on there, a lot to pull apart there. We have a Mishnah class ahead of us, so we can't get too tangled up in the text of Esther, though. It's a tangled, a beautifully tangled text. But just one more example before we start looking at the Mishnah. Then it happens to the Jews, right? I said it starts with misogyny, moves quickly to anti-Semitism, and they're connected. How are they connected? Well, they're connected through language, of course, and they're connected through the echo of events is echoed through the same language. On the 13th day of the first month, this is by now the third chapter of the book of Esther, the king's scribes, Sofrei HaMelech, were summoned, and they wrote as Haman directed to all of the governors of every province and to the officials of every people, to the province, again, in its own script, and to every people in its own language. And the orders were issued in the name of the king. So again, there's it's actually, we can say a lot of bad things about King Ahasuerus's kingdom, but it's quite accessible. Like everybody has it's like all the languages listed, like pretty impressive. He ruled over 127 provinces after all. So they think that's sort of, I think what you're imagining is like everybody having it translated. And that's important. And that's important in this society. And what is it that's translated? Is that scrolls were dispatched to massacre and exterminate all the Jews, young and old, children and women on a single day. Okay, so here's one more. There's one more word there I want to highlight before we move on. But you see the way that the written word is that which affects our destruction in the story. It's that thing which is used to control women, and then it's that thing that's used to control Jews, and that's the power. It's the power of writing, and don't get me wrong, it's the power of the king's writing also. This power itself is implicated by the written word and which written word is chosen, but it will be accommodated to everyone. Everybody has their own way of receiving a message. Okay, so I hope I've convinced you those themes are explicit, writ large. We could keep going. Esther writes in the story, Mordechai writes in the story, but the king reads in the story, Haman reads, okay. Now, let's take a look at the Mishnah. And the Mishnah takes this conversation up sort of sideways by thinking about scrolls and how they ought to be written, and not just any scrolls, but the scrolls that we'll be reading from on Purim, the scroll of the Megillah, and related, the scroll of the Torah. And the category for thinking about what's called sofrut, scribal writing, the category is stam, and stam stands for svarim, books, tefillin, prayer boxes, and mezuzot, right? Mezuzot, the things you kiss, all of which have little parchment and writing in them, the latter two, and then one is actual parchment. Now, I'm about to move into this, but I have to say, before I move on, I have a moment for a pause here, that Yonatan Reches is with us, and Yonatan just created a kosher set of tefillin, like literally created a kosher set of tefillin that was not taken from the killing of an animal. So a very
almost there, actually. They're still in process.
They're still in process. Okay.
Yeah.
So I just want to share that because it's a very do you want to say a word about it, Yonatan? Or do you want to, you don't have to be put on the spot.
You don't have to ask me twice. Sure.
Okay, do it.
As I'm sure we'll read here, there are 4 ritual objects in Judaism that require hides, right? So there's Torah scrolls, tefillin, mezuzahs, and scrolls of Esther. And de facto, they are all made on slaughtered hides. They don't have to be, but they all de facto always are, and usually on hides that are imported by the hundreds on pallets from China, from the worst slaughterhouses you can imagine, usually written in workshops that exclude women, queers, and converts from engaging in this work. And so there's a group of us here in Oklahoma who are working to change that. We picked up 3 roadkill animals, 2 deer, 1 sheep, and we've started using them to write mezuzot and to make tefillin. So we're hoping to scale up from there.
Woo!
Thank you for
Is that amazing?
my plug-in.
That's amazing. Halacha l'maseh. That's the phrase. Halacha l'maseh. Like our practice really lived in action in real time. How do we live out and really I'm so inspired by that engagement with the mitzvot. Okay, so that's an example. Yasher koach to Yonatan. That's an example of one of the items that we'll soon see. They're listed usually here as 3, but as you can see, Yonatan divided up Torah scrolls and Megillah scrolls. So, that's part of how this conversation gets kicked up in particular on Purim. But let's take a look here. Let's take a look. Okay. The only difference between scrolls and like Sfarim, here's that word again. And we just saw Sfarim were sent out, right? We just saw them sent out here, okay? Scrolls. Okay, here's that word again. The only difference between scrolls and tefillin and mezuzot is that Torah scrolls, this, by the way, I must just say, if this is a confusing opening, this is in a strange section of the Mishnah that begins by saying, the only difference between Shabbat and the holidays is that on Shabbat you can't cook, and on the holidays you can't. And then that just becomes a formula. Ein bain. There's no difference between these 2 things and these 2 things, or these 2 things and this 3rd thing, except for the following. And often it seems like, yeah, but that difference is huge. Or maybe there are other differences, but this is like this is the way they're teaching in this section. So ein bain, this is the ein bains, and ein bain sfarim. There's the only difference between scrolls and then tefillin and mezuzah, because they all have to be written. They're all written down on parchment. Is that Torah scrolls are written in any language? Did you catch that? Now that's whoa. You would think the Torah of anything has to be written in Hebrew, but no, tefillin, the prayer boxes, and mezuzot, the doorway boxes, have to have parchment that's written only, whereas tefillin and mezuzot are written only in Ashurit. Now, we're going to take up what Ashurit is later in the conversation. It hasn't been much of a conversation yet, I admit, but for now, we're just going to use it to mean the fancy Hebrew script. The fancy Hebrew script, let's think of it as this script right here is Ashurit, even though the word we might translate as Syrian. Okay, but that's okay. Don't get too confused yet. Think about the way we use Latin letters or Roman numerals, right? Okay, so the way that we refer to fancy Hebrew script here is Ashurit. Okay, so that's what. Let's just stop there. Now we're in it. Okay, let's stop and just think. What are we've shifted modes. We're learning now law, and the law is tefillin and mezuzot have to be written in fancy Hebrew, nice Hebrew, calligraphy or writing, block writing, whatever. What is Ashurit? But a Torah can be written in any language. In any language. Now, why would that be? Why would that be? Any thoughts on that? Yeah, Hal.
Well, the first thing that occurs to me is that the tefillin and the mezuzot, you don't have to read as part of ritual observance. They're just locked away. And the Torah scroll and the Megillat Esther, you have to read, so it would make more sense to have it available in the Vulgate, to use Vatican II terminology. So anyways.
Excellent and articulate. Couldn't say it any better. Jessica.
I can't remember where I saw it, but I thought there was something about that the Torah could only be written in Greek or Hebrew. What am I thinking of?
It says Brucha Shekivant. It's like such a great group of thinkers, and you intuit exactly where we're going. Where do you find that? That's in the next section of the Mishnah. Let's go back and take a look. Exactly right. Your mind is going in the right direction. The only difference between scrolls and tefillin and mezuzot is that Torah scrolls, and here this is the insertion, is that Torah scrolls, but again, it's just scrolls, and for our purposes, it'll mean Megillot as well. Scrolls are written in any language, whereas tefillin and mezuzot are written only in Ashurit. Okay, then Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, the head rabbi of the time, said, Af besvarim, even with scrolls, they only gave permission for them to be written, meaning other than in Hebrew, because presumably, yeah, of course you can read it, you can write them in Hebrew. They only gave permission for them to be written in Hebrew or Greek. And this is Hanukkah Torah. Okay, so we can't go all the way down this rabbit hole because this is one of the things we think about on Hanukkah. And here's what I'll do for you. I'll give you a beautiful summary by Rav Ovadia Mibar Tanura, the great commentator on the Mishnah. Isn't that nice of me? The great commentator on the Talmud is Rashi, but the most famous commentary that just takes into account the Mishnah, which we're studying, is the commentary of Rav Ovadia Mibar Tanura. There's now a wine named after him. I believe that's Italian, Mibar Tanura. He does a nice summary of the discussion on this Greek problem issue, and that is right here. Oh, Jessica's saying that I wrote about this in my book, right? I did.
This is where isn't that funny? I'm quoting you to you. I was like, I know I read this somewhere. Where did I read it? And of course, I read it from you. This perfect.
That is like that's a weird kind of echo chamber, right? Okay, cool. So that's awesome. So you're about to see something that is in that book. Hey Vera, if you're online, can you put a link to? I feel like anytime there's a book comes up, I should promote it. My publisher is like, make sure you mention the book. So if you can, Vera, link to the book. Okay, so take a look. This is what I wrote about in that book. There's an idea here that's actually quite interesting, if not profound, and it's the whole idea of like the primacy of Greek. Even as it's the enemy in the Hanukkah story, it also becomes a language and a culture and, or I should say a culture and so a language that has great respect. And so this is an important point. I'm sort of careening into it here because like, oh, you mentioned the book and now I'm going to show you the Barton Nura, but like, let's just take a beat. And it's an important point because what we have seen is the Torah or the Megillah can be written in any language, right? And that's a huge difference than the more ritualized objects. Hal gave us a great reason why that would be so. But the implication of Hal's reason is that the Torah should be something that anyone can read. It can be translated into any language. Like, it should be accessible. And the rabbis felt that. You should read it, be able to write a Torah in English, as we do. You should be able to write a Torah in Chinese, as we do. It should be accessible in any language. But then this is like a pullback. They get a little nervous about that. The other opinion is, whoa. Not just any language. Like, it's the Torah. And whether it's safeguarding information or just a holiness, we could talk about that. But you don't write it in any language, but you can write it in Greek. And why is that? Okay, so like I said, it's Hanukkah Torah. We're not going to spend all our time, but I do want to give you a little bit of a little side tour here. The Mibart Nura says is that it says this is the blessing that Noah gives to one of his sons, Yafet. And Noah says, may God enlarge Yafet and let him dwell in the tents of Shem. Shem is his brother. Now Shem, this is complicated, but Shem is thought to be the progenitor of Abraham. And Yafet is thought to be the progenitor of Yavan or Greece. Okay, so this weird blessing, like, may God enlarge Yafet and let him dwell in the tents of Shem. And also the name Yafet is related to the word for beauty, Yofi. Okay, so this is a complicated, and if it's confusing you, it's okay. We're going to jump back into another direction soon. But the interpretation the rabbis gave is that the beauty of Yafet, that is the beautiful language of, this should say Yafet again. Put it in that is found among all the children of Yafet, let them dwell in the tents of Shem. There's no more beautiful language among all the children of Yafet like the Greek language. They thought Greek was beautiful. They admired Greek beauty. And so they found a place in the Torah where it says that Greek beauty should be in our tents. Greek beauty is something we admire and something we esteem. And the way that we do that is not to have a Greek statue in the middle of the shul, but to have the Torah written in Greek, because our statue is language, okay? All right. All right. So that's where we're at. That's sort of like the tee off here. And let me pause just again to see if like there's anything I've dropped or anything you're seeing here as we've now laid out. Oh, and let me say one last thing, which is that we have a layering here. Torah can be written in any language. Megillah could be written in any language. No, Torah has to be written in only Hebrew and Greek. And then the Midbar Nur also reminds us that the ultimate ruling is that we can only write it in Greek. We agree. And we also think that at this time, the Greek language, whatever, this is like a pullback. The Greek language has become lost and confounded. That must not be the Greek. I can't believe it. We're not going to give Greek, modern day Greek or even ancient Greek that much privilege. Therefore, at this time, we don't write scrolls in other than the holy writing and the holy language. Scrolls, like you could write a translation, but not a scroll. This idea was that you would have a Torah scroll in Greek, all right? But then they pull back from that. It's just too much. It's crazy. It's that they can't bear. Okay, so now let me just pause here. What's going on? Let me try to ask an actual good question and just say, instead of just saying somebody. What's the anxiety here or the desire here? Like there's a desire to open this up and there's an anxiety that it should stay in Hebrew. And what do you think are the values that are sort of being pushed back and forth there? What is it like? Is it spiritual? Is it linguistic? Is it cultural? Like, what do you think is going on here? Let's start with Payam.
I just had a question. What's the original language of the Megillah? Isn't it in Farsi or is it in Hebrew?
Well, I don't know if there's historians who are going to jump all over me here, but like this is Hebrew literature. Like this is, whether it's borrowed from another tale is a question I think historians do speculate on. But like this, we're talking about Megillat Esther. We're talking about and we're talking about Megillat Esther, and we're talking about the Torah. We're talking about Hebrew literature and the best of it, might I add, the best of it. I mean, part of the reason that we're getting all worked up about the Torah and Megillat Esther, honestly, is because it's just some of the best writing ever produced in Hebrew. So this is our story. And part of the question we're asking is, can our story be translated and retain its, I don't know, blank? Like, what are the values? Let's keep wondering. Leah Matsui.
I'm not sure about this, but isn't one of the characteristics of the fancy script of Hebrew is that there are symbols and signs that have amuletic significance, size of the letters, the spacing on the page, crowns, dots. I certainly don't understand enough, but that has been my impression.
Okay. All right. Okay. I'm going to take this opportunity. This is what Leah's asking is really important, because I'm going to take this opportunity to like kind of cut through quickly to the rest of the class instead of pacing it out. Like, I just want to like give you everything right now because Leah's question cracks open a whole new layer here. What we're currently analyzing is, first of all, we've noted the prominent role of writing and reading and hearing in the Purim experience, both halachically and as narrative. And now we're noting a tension between the desire to make, just as King Achashverosh did, to make this available in any language versus the need to pull back. And then Leah so helpfully at this moment wonders about, but wait a minute, isn't the script of Hebrew itself sacred, right? Isn't it? Don't, after all, the Kabbalists and the Midrashists before them talk about the shape of the Aleph, the shape, and why is the bet pointing outwards? Because everything is possible with blessing, you know, like that kind of talk, like that presumes a certain form of letter. Now, what was the form of the letter? Now, here things get really trippy real quick. Okay, so let's take a look now at another Mishnah, and then we're going to look at another piece of Talmud, and then we'll be okay. We'll have I know it's like I'm force feed. This is like a hose coming at you, but then you'll have all the information you need. Okay, now we're continuing to talk about the Megillah and how you read the Megillah. And here's some laws. These are some good laws. One who reads the Megillah out of order has not fulfilled their obligation. You can't go chapter 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. Why? Well, think about it, but you can't do that. And if one read it by heart, or if one read it in translation in some other language. Now, this seems like it must mean, and all the commentators, because remember, we just said, what do you mean? You can translate it. Is this a new law? No, the way they understand this is if you read it in translation in some other language that you don't understand. So if you read the Megillah either by heart or out of order, or in, let's say I read it in a German translation, but I don't understand German, then I've not fulfilled my obligation. Now I could pause here and ask you, like, what's the meaning of all that? And you could give me the answer. I'm not going to waste your time. Like, there's something about you're needing to understand what you're hearing, and also it needs to be a read thing, because you can't do it by heart either, right? It has to be understandable from a narrative kind of flow. You can't just read nonsense. You can't read language, even if it's real language that sounds to you like nonsense, and you can't read it by heart. So they're not all the same, but they're all kind of moving around comprehension. Reading comprehension has to be read and comprehended, okay? And then we get the second part of the Mishnah here. And the second part of the Mishnah brings us back to this question of the Hebrew script. However, for those who speak a foreign language, they may read in that foreign language. Let me just read that again, because you just got a wallop of a teaching from the Mishnah, a wallop of a teaching. For those who speak a foreign language, they may read in that foreign language. Aval korinota laloazot balaz. Foreign speakers can read the Megillah in a foreign language, but V'haloez sheshama ashurit, but if the foreigner hears it in Hebrew, yatsa, they've fulfilled their obligation. Now, just take a look, and I know I'm being fairly didactic this class, but I just got to make sure to get all the points out. If you read it in translation, and the only way to make sense of this is in some other language you don't understand, then you've not fulfilled your obligation. You can read it in translation in your own language, and you cannot understand it in Hebrew, okay, which is what a lot of us do. But that's an interesting value system laid out there, okay? And it is actually true, according to the law of the Mishnah, you could write a Megillah in English. Or Aramaic, or Greek, or any language that you would understand, but you can't use one that someone else wrote. That's not fulfilling your obligation. You have to understand what you're reading, unless it's in Hebrew. And then hearing the chanted words that are in Hebrew is good enough. But it didn't say Hebrew, did it? It said Ashurit. What is Ashurit? What is Ashurit? And I said before, Ashurit literally means Syrian. I was like, what do you mean Syrian? But this is the idea, is there's a concept of Ktav Ashuri, the Syrian script. And here's the discussion of it in the Talmud. First of all, you know what? First of all, in case you're sitting there now just kind of buried in, dense textual moves, let me give you something to read on the side. Here is the Wikipedia page for Ktav Ashuri, in case you want to do. I know there's a class that happens here in Zoom. There's a class that happens in the chat. There's the class that happens in your mind when you're going and looking at other things. It's all Torah. Okay, so this is the idea. Let's teach it, and then we'll look at it. Okay, let's first teach the idea of Ktav Ashuri, which means the Syrian script, okay? And this is the fascinating, mind-blowing text from the Talmud that says the following, and totally challenges the whole notion of the sacred Hebrew script. Mar Zutra says, and some say that it is Mar Ukva, they weren't sure who said this, that initially the Torah was given, now it's not even the Megillah, the Torah was given to the Jewish people in Ktav Ivri, in Ivri, or as you can probably tell, that's Hebrew script. Okay, and Lashon HaKodesh. Oops, that was weird. What just happened there? Okay, I don't know what's happening. And in Ivri script and the sacred, oh my gosh, this is getting crazy. Oh my gosh, technical difficulties. Sorry about that. Okay, Ivri script and the sacred tongue. Originally, it was given in something called Hebrew script, and Lashon HaKodesh, which I don't know, I guess that's the Hebrew sound or pronunciation. It's actually not so clear. The sacred tongue, the sacred language. It was given to them then again in the days of Ezra, meaning when they came back from exile, they had a new writing system. And the new writing system was Ashurit. And they had a new pronunciation, and the new pronunciation was Aramaic. Okay? So they came back and they were trying to rebuild things. They had a whole new way of writing and a whole new way of speaking. And the Jewish people chose for themselves, Biraru Lahen Yisrael, they chose for themselves the Ashurit script and the sacred tongue, meaning the original pronunciation, but the new writing for the Torah scroll. And they left Ivrit, they left Hebrew and the Aramaic tongue for the common, the Vulgate, the common language. Okay. Let's just say what technical difficulties. Let's just say what just happened there, and then we have a nice, good 20 minutes to like process. This class is like all the dump up front, okay? But what you just saw in the Talmud is an assertion that there was an original script and original sound to the Torah. That Moses wrote down the Torah in something called Hebrew, and we pronounced it in something called Hebrew. Or actually, they don't say that. They just say the holy pronunciation. And then we went into exile and we came back. We spoke differently and we wrote differently. And then we decided, you know what? We're going to go back to the original language or pronunciation, but we're going to keep the new script. And presumably because it's nicer, it's better. So let's take a look at what that script might look like. Various theories. This is the old script, Ktav Ivri, or some other version of it. But you know what I'm talking about when they do the Hebrew like language classes and they show you that originally they're like very simplistic stick figure forms of Hebrew, and the letters actually look a little different. You can see how they morphed over time, and one was maybe more pictorial and meant to represent bull's horns. Maybe you've seen this, but whatever it is, it looks something more like this. And Syrian script, Syrian Hebrew looks something more like this. And you know what? That's the Hebrew we use. There it is. Okay, Syrian and Ivri, Ashurit Ivrit. Okay, all right. So let's just take a breath here. I just really like gave a lot to you at the same time. But do you see how Leah's question requires all of that background information, because something wild is happening where we are learning that by the Talmud's own admission, or at least one of the sages of the Talmud, we don't read Hebrew in the script that Moses wrote it in. Right? That's a wild thing. Now, we've gotten to the point where we're talking about being able to write Torah scrolls in Greek. So it's wild on the one hand that the Torah can be written in any language, and it's wild on the other hand that like the guarded language is not even really the original according to the story. Okay. So where does that leave us? Okay. So where does that leave us? What are we saying about writing the Torah or the Megillah? What is that act that act of writing down our sacred story on these scrolls. We already said, oh, it's different than mezuzah or tefillin because they just have to be in Hebrew. Fine, or let's leave them aside. But now for the thing that we actually read and care about and learn from and understand, there's this wild range of possibilities where on the one hand, it could be in any language in the world. And on the other hand, it's like sacredly guarded in a language that isn't the original language, but pronounced in the original way, or I'm not even sure exactly. There are other ways to read that piece of Talmud, but let's now finally open up the conversation. We'll just talk for the rest of our time together about what is being said about the power of writing things down in a scroll. Okay, let's start with Yonatan.
Okay, so first of all, it's really cool to me that we're studying this, and the source that you brought in is one of the sources that my mentor made me study when learning to scribe. Most of the stuff that I'm about to say, I only recently learned, and it feels like cheating, but I'll say it anyways. There used to be so much more of a diversity of thought and of practice in scribing in Judaism, and it's one of those facets of Judaism where the practice with time, and I mean, as recently as the 19th century, has gotten more restrictive with time and more specialized. And Hal put a lovely comment in the chat about job stability for scribes, which I think is not at all misplaced, and how the people who are making the decisions of what's allowed and what's not allowed are people who in some way are trying, like they've established themselves as experts and they're trying to keep the masses out. I don't think that's the only thing that's going on. I think there are a lot of reasons why the practice becomes more exclusive. By the way, Scrolls of Esther, like it's true that technically you can write them in any language, but really you can't, because there are words that we don't know what they mean anymore, right? So they can really, they can really only be written in Hebrew, because you can't translate Al-Gaman. Nobody knows what Al-Gaman is, right? Or various other names for fabrics and animals or whatever that are in there.
But I will say this is very okay. So first of all, I want to just echo because you said something very significant. The idea that keeping things in a holy language is often keeping things guarded from an outside, either from being diffused or from an outside culture, from access to an outside culture, or even to other members of the same culture. But there's a kind of a guarding that goes on there. And I want to say, you're absolutely right. It is not normative, ultimately, to write a Megillah in any other language, though I have heard people doing it for particular reasons, people who are, developmentally different and actually being given permission to write a Megillah in English on a scroll. So I don't know what you're right. It's very non-normative, but there it is in the Mishnah. And there's some people
you can write whatever you want on a scroll, but the question of, do you fulfill your obligation to hear the Megillah heard if it's being read to you in English? That's a difficult one to answer. What I recently wound up saying to a non-Jewish friend of mine, a colleague of mine at the Air Force, who asked me about, why do you buy into all of these rules that are made by people? Shouldn't this be like, you have a commandment, and this was specific to mezuzot, but this applies to all scribal work. You got a commandment to write this thing and put it up on your doorpost. That commandment came from God. Why are you listening to people? And in the moment, because this is a colonel in the Air Force, what I said to him is, you wear a uniform, and to some extent, some facets of a uniform are inherent, right? Like the idea of order and the idea of camouflage and the information, like the fact that a uniform needs to have information on it. But the main idea of a uniform is that it's the same for everyone, that it looks good, that it looks professional, that when you see someone wearing a uniform, your first impression of them is, this is a sergeant in the US Air Force, or this is a corporal in the US Army, or whatever the case may be. So in addition to just like the inherent basic requirements, people set a lot of the rules And it's not that strange. It's not that like we accept this everywhere else in our lives, that some things would be arbitrary, except somebody made a rule. And now we live by it.
Let me echo that as well, because and then I want to give you another minute, and then I want to hear from some others. But that idea, you're using the analogy of a uniform, and that's right. And I get to kind of take it back and make the analogy even like smaller by just referring to our, Helveticas and our, serifs and sans serifs, and like what that means, and the way that, we just have agreements. These are good ways to write it, and this is a proper way to write it, and that doesn't look formal. And why doesn't it look formal? And why does like ye old, tavern look ancient and all? So there's like those things actually. There's something about that does, work with our brains, if nothing else, right? Okay. One more thought, Jonathan.
Those are all my thoughts.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you for all of that. Thank you for all of that. Obviously, someone who's thought a lot about this. So really valuable to have you in our conversation, Jonathan. Okay, let's hear from Matt. Oh, I can't hear you, Matt.
You can't hear me? Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Can you hear me? Yes, okay. This is a big break from what the Torah says, because the Torah has primacy of voice. It has primacy of voice and speech, and not text. That we have God said, and we have people talking about things rather. So it's an interesting thing that it's I call this a metaphysical change. This thing of power of word, power of script, rather, power of writing, rather than power of voice, is a metaphysical change in their view of the world.
You're absolutely right, Matt, and it's your comments allude to something that is actually of profound overarching significance, right? Because inevitably now we're talking about the Torah. That's just not just a story or a text. We're talking about our record of our encounter with God. Revelation, not to put too fine a point on it, right? And the idea, and Matt's right, and that revelation happened auditorially. Even to Moshe, it happened, I don't know, in his brain, but it was dictated, and he wrote it in a script. Now, what do we think? Do we think that, and the Torah says that Moshe wrote these words down, that Moshe was supposed to write these words down, that's part of what happens there. But what Moshe's capturing, yet we're talking about it like it's like, what was the original language? But what we're really saying is, what is the thing that we're trying to capture that is the essence of it all? The whole thing, Torah, the word of God. What even was it? The sound of God, the voice of God, the impression of God, our interpretation of it. We put it into language, and this is the big problem. It's thrilling and catastrophic, which is that when we take divinity and we put it into language, we lose something. It can't possibly contain the word of God. The word of God means something beyond any word. So we've lost something, because now it's in English or French or Chinese or Arabic or Hebrew. Even if it's in Hebrew, we lose something. That's the idea. What is Lashon HaKodesh? What is the holy tongue? What is Ketav HaKodesh, the holy script? Did Moses really write in block letters and not? No, the idea is that we don't even know how to get back to that experience. We don't even know how to capture that experience in the first place. This is so loaded. This conversation is so loaded. It's like there's something dangerous about language and the power of language to take something and concretize. Okay, now I'm saying too much. All right. Let's turn it over to Jen, who is a more thoughtful speaker.
And I mean, it's interesting because I'm kind of along your lines and maybe taking it a step further. I keep thinking of that, phrase traditore. I think that Italian is like, to translate is to betray. And not only do we take, but we also insert our own ideas when we translate. So it seems to me like what's going on in this conversation about whether you can translate and how much and why is this idea of like, how far does the divine have to go? How far is the divine willing to go to meet us where we're at? And how far do we have to push ourselves to meet the divine where it's at? And some of the answers are different at different times. Historically, there may have been in Ezra's time a reason why people needed to understand when it was read out loud, possibly for political reasons, right? Sometimes for spiritual reasons. You are never going to be able to understand it in the Hebrew. Read it so that you can understand it. So it's just this interesting to me conversation about how flexible is God and how flexible can we be in our encounters with God. Just echoed right through the text. And the idea that meeting us halfway means we bring ourselves halfway and change the experience as well.
Good. Okay. Yeah, that's right. And I'm especially struck by the really, really sharp thinking you did around the shifting needs in a given historical moment. And you refer to the period of Esther, and they do in the Talmud, and that's exactly right, because the period of Esther was kind of known as a period of great instability, but also great potential, a kind of rebuilding, a kind of like, we can restart Jewish society again. But what then is the role of language in that society? And think about like the rebuilding that happened in the modern state of Israel, and the thinking around language in that project, and whether you make things and now jump over to the North American continent and think about all of the Judaism that is made accessible and translated for folks who are like Jewishly like identified and passionate, but don't have a linguistic familiarity with the ancient tongue, and with those different choices and the way they play out in such different ways, and think about people trying to make decisions, rabbis, statespeople, language specialists and dictionary writers, and right, there's like a great, this is this idea of translating everything or keeping everything pure, very different values that might play out differently in different moments. And let me say something else, which is that Hanukkah has its own complicated relationship, another assimilation story. It's a complicated relationship with the preservation of language. And what's the other great language in that story is Greek. In this conversation, Greek's good enough. In that conversation, it's the problem. Talk about a historical discrepancy, right? And just different historical needs. All right, let's see if we can hear from a couple more. Irene Michaels.
Couldn't find the unmute button. 3 things. One is that you can't translate anything from one language to another without losing a lot, especially poetry, which, a lot of the Torah is. A second is there's something about tribal connection that I enjoy, that we're all saying the same sounds, even if we don't have a clue what in the world. We're just going bibbity bobbity boo, but we're doing it at the same time. We're doing it on Shabbat. I love that. And we're making sounds that Jews made in Babylon, at least. And I love that. And then the third thing is, once you freeze a language and a script, and it's always read that way forever, words lose their meaning. I mean, can you imagine reading things in like Chaucerian English now? What in the world? And just to bring up Greek at the last moment, my mother was Greek Orthodox, and I once asked her, what the heck are they saying? She said, I don't know. She spoke Greek fluently, but she could not understand most of the liturgy. Even Greek is not the same Greek, because language changes. But once it's codified into these are the prayers, eventually we don't know what some of the words mean. So those are my 3 points. I wrote them down so I'd be fast.
You were good and fast and incisive and really helpful. And I so appreciate especially this idea that it's all Greek to me. It could be said by a Greek person. In other words, part of what you're saying here just as a truth, which is that we wouldn't understand the original English if it was spoken already, and certainly not the original Hebrew as it was spoken, right? And if you think about the Taimani, the Yemenite pronunciation, how different it is, you start to realize that the language is always changing and changing enough that we also must have some sense that we can't have the Hebrew that Moshe had. It can't be because there's just been too much time. But that's a scary idea, because even if we're writing it the same way, we're surely not pronouncing it as Moshe pronounced it. Or are we? Because it's scary to think we're not, because then we have indeed lost something along the way. And maybe we just need to be mature enough to say, yeah, you lose things along the way. Or maybe somehow, like, we are, like, when the people of Israel chose this script, but they kept the holy tongue, they were saying there's something we've got that goes all the way back, but surely we're going to write it in this beautiful language now. Like, some things change and some things stay the same. Okay, I'm sorry to those whose hands are up. We are out of time, but I want to just end where we began by pointing out that this is not just halachic speculation. I hope you feel like we've gotten to some of the deepest themes in the Purim story, but just remember where we started, which is that the proclamations to oppress women were sent out in writing and script, and it had to be translated for everybody. And the proclamations to exterminate the Jews were in this writing and script, and that was the way that was done. And finally, as the Jews are victorious in the end, or they gain some kind of allyship with the king, they say, well, okay, Jews, you now can write with regard to the Jews as you see fit. Write in the king's name and seal it with the king's signet, for an edict has been written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet, may not be revoked. So the king's scribes were summoned at that time on the 23rd day of the 3rd month, that is the month of Sivan, and the letters were written. I mean, again, this language, at Mordechai's dictation, and to the Jews and the satraps, I don't know what that word is, the governors and the officials of the 127 provinces from India to Nubia, to every province in its own script. We saw that before, and to every people in its own language. And look, ve'el haYehudim kichtavam v'chilshonam, and to the Jews in their own script and their own language. And that's part of what we gain in the Purim story. That moment of triumph is a moment where we can write something and distribute it, and it will be translated, but we can also write it in our own language and in our own script. And that's part of the power of Purim, is reclaiming the power of the written word, which can be used against us and which we can claim and use as a source of our own power and vitality in the world. So may we all be inspired by the written words of the Megillah, and may you focus in on this mitzvah this year to actually hear the words as they're chanted, even if you don't understand them perfectly. And you know what? None of us understand them perfectly. We couldn't possibly. Okay, so we'll leave it there. I wish you a Freilichen Purim. We're having a celebration at Ikar tonight. You should join us if you're in the area. Love to you all.